Good morning, everyone, and welcome to our webinar on how to write a business continuity plan. I will shortly pass over to our presenter, Chris Butler, our Resilience Director here at Data Barracks. But first, just a couple of bits of administration. So if any of you have joined our webinars before, you know we're very tight on our timings, so we will keep strictly to 30 minutes in duration for the presentation and the main body of the content. But then after that, there'll also be some Q&As. So if you aren't able to stick around for the whole of the Q&A session as well, and you are tight on time, then don't worry. We will be, of course, sending the slides and recording and all resources from today's webinar over to you in an email after the whole event this morning. As mentioned, Q&As, we've also already received some questions through prior to the events, which we'll be picking up on through the presentation and afterwards. But if you do have any questions during the webinar, please use the panel on the right-hand side, add them in, and Chris will be able to pick them up for you at the end of the webinar. So without any further delays, I'll pass over to Chris.
Thank you very much, Andy. Good morning, everyone. Once again, really delighted to have so many people sign up for our latest webinar. Do feel free to ask any questions. We will have time for that at the end, as Andy has just said. But I promise I'll stick faithfully to 30 minutes. And what I want to talk about to start with then, when in describing or discussing how to write a business continuity plan, is really to think about some of the challenges that people face initially in trying to get going. So today is really about the whole process of BC planning and getting to the point where you've got a business continuity plan, but that involves more than just jumping straight to putting pen to paper. So one of the first challenges that people have, and one of the first questions that often comes our way is, what does a BC plan actually look like? And how long should it be? Should we be going for something really short, perhaps page, 2 pages, or should it be a big tome full of details? Well, as ever, the answer can often be it depends on the type of the organization that you are, but the basic answer should really be that it should be as short as is possible given your circumstances. Brevity is a great thing when it comes to business continuity planning. You want to be able to have something that people can use easily, and if you've got a massive weighty document in front of you, it's going to be really difficult to get through it all. I've been on several events over the years where you walk into a customer and the big BC plan is sat there, a big weight in the middle of the table, and it's never opened. That's not the situation you want to be in. So the plans need to be brief, but they need to be workable. So it depends on the organization. If you've got a small, simple business, you definitely don't need anything long. But then again, if you're an organization that has multiple sites, provides multiple services and functions, and you've got lots of staff, then you will need something different. So one size doesn't fit all. But we have talked about this in the past, and perhaps an example from our BC podcast, which is called the BCP cast. Link to that will be in the resources section at the end. For example, we were talking there with one of our conversations around a small printing firm, only 10 or so people in the Lake District, in an area prone to flooding. They would never know to go to the Business Continuity Institute or the British Standards Institute to go and ask for an ISO audit, but they did know about keeping their business going. So they had a simple plan that worked to help them keep going in the event of flooding affecting their business, and were able to then keep going with serving their customers. But equally, we've worked with other much larger companies, and if you think about a company like BP, or indeed a company like Volkswagen, where you've got multiple factories, multiple sites, multiple brands, then you're in a different position entirely. You can't just have one single plan, business continuity plan for an organization like that. You need lots of individual plans that serves the needs of each site, of each location. So you really need to start from asking yourself the right question. If you're standing in the street in the rain because your building evacuation alarm has gone off and you can't use the building anymore, what is it that you actually need from a business continuity perspective in that situation? Or alternatively, if you're in your office and your IT goes down and you find yourself staring at a blank monitor, or even worst case, a ransomware demand screen, and you've lost all of your IT, and your IT team thinks you've been the victim of a cyber attack, and all you've got is your phone, what do you do? The bottom line then is, when thinking about your BC plan, is keep it simple. The amount of detail needs to be consistent with the nature of the business that you are, the environment you work in, including the size, the complexity, the geographic spread, and indeed another factor is whether you're regulated. Another question that we're often asked is, where do you start? And obviously you start at the beginning, and it might feel like, if you were told to create a business continuity plan, it might feel like a mammoth task ahead of you, and you're uncertain where to start. Often people will jump in to writing the plan and straight into the details of how do I recover system X or department Y, and getting into the writing of the run books. That's not really where you need to start, because you can risk there overcomplicating things or getting some of the detail wrong. Think about it logically from your business point of view. You know what your business does, you know what you deliver to your customers, you know what services you provide, and you know how your staff work. But within all of that, you also know, because you work in your business, what's really important and what your priorities are. So you need to focus on that. When you start thinking about writing a BC plan, think about what's important to you, think about how you deliver them, think about the operational and the technology dependencies that need to come together to deliver those important services. Because you know full well that teams and your systems don't work in isolation, they all work together. A simple example would be that the finance team does need the HR team in order to run the payroll on a monthly basis. That's one very good, very classic BC example. But equally, you should know from a technology point of view that you can't restore a particular application into the production environment without the components that make up that IT system. So that would include having a domain controller, an application server, or a network. You need those things available to you. So where do you start is a very good question. Well, the great news is there's lots of very good guidance on this, and this today just forms part of that. And some of you, indeed, those of you who are proper BC practitioners, will know about the Business Continuity Institute, and they published this document called the Good Practice Guidelines, and the latest one, version 7, is the one that's been published this year. And as I say, if you've got any real experience in continuity, you'll already be familiar with it. It does provide really good guidance for practitioners and for those who have been tasked with writing a BC plan for their organization. Now, today's not about going through the good practice guidance itself at all, but it's worth having a think about it. If you're a member of the BCI, then you can get this for free, but it does cost if you aren't, and you can get it from their website. So we will actually put a link to that in the resources at the end as well. Not a plug for the BCI, but some good guidance anyway, if you want something to read and pick up on beyond this webinar. So let's now move on and think what the key steps are to generating a business continuity plan. And it breaks down to several sections. As you can see, we're not diving straight into writing the plans. The top half, was that 4 or 5 steps there, are all about self-reflection, looking at the business and working out what's important. And then the bottom half is about how you then pull all that together and manage what you need to manage in order to stay operational. The reason why you don't rush into the later stages is you can risk overspending and spending money on the wrong sorts of capabilities that you don't really need, and putting in things that aren't aligned to your business priorities. So where do you start? Well, you start with what's important to you. You set out your policy, and you can do this in something like a management business continuity statement. This sets out your priorities, sets out why you're doing business continuity in your business, what it is that you want to achieve, what's important to you. For example, if you're Facebook, and I know none of us are, you could say, we're Facebook, our servers never go down. So that means your focus is on uptime of your IT systems. Or you could be another type of firm where you understand fully that actually the impacts to you won't really be felt for some time. So you say, we need to be back up and running within 14 days of an incident. Having that clarity at the management level is important to set out what it is that you're going to be focusing on in business continuity. So therefore, what's in scope for your BCP, what's out of scope? You really important to differentiate that, and bear in mind that it's difficult to boil the ocean or eat the elephant all at once, take your metaphor as you like, and focus on what your priorities are. So once you've got that nailed and you understand what your scope is, work out who needs to be involved, which is looking at the people who are going to be responsible for the planning and the implementation, and indeed the response of business continuity plans. Who needs to be involved? In other words, who are the key decision makers, and who should be involved because they've got the aptitude to work well in the time of a disruption, whether that's an incident or a full-blown crisis. And then beside that, also think about what development needs members of your team might need, both from a understanding how to make BC work in the organization, but also from a incident response perspective as well. So once you've got those people together, you then need to work out what the impacts are on the business. You get into detail here, and this is where the BIA, the business impact analysis, comes into play. This is where you pull apart your business to look at what's important to you and work out the impacts. This is a really important stage, and we're going to cover this, or all these steps, in a little bit more detail shortly. The BIA is a critical part of running your BC plan. And as part of your BIA, you also look at your risks and your threats, and you look at and review and assess what the likely risks are to your business are, what's the most demanding sort of risks. Now, you're not, again, going to be able to cover every possible risk. You need to work out what the most demanding ones are, what's the worst case scenario for you, and start there. And don't forget, you can, of course, always develop and advance this over time, given that we like to take a life cycle approach to business continuity planning anyway. So once you know that, you can then pull apart and decide what your critical business functions are and the services that support them. Now, there are tools available for this. We've got one that's on our website. It's a fairly simple technology dependency mapping tool that helps you identify your services and then map them out to work out what the critical components are, both in an IT and also in a business sense. So you can work out what the interdependencies are. And I'll show you an example of that tool later on. So this whole section, if you like, that's your planning phase. As you say, as you can see there, it takes up half of the approach to developing your BC plan is actually doing the planning to get your plan up and running. But once you've done that, then you need to work out what you need to do through mitigating or any possible worst impacts of a disruption. And this is where you design strategies and solutions and putting capabilities in place. And this involves this is where you have to start spending money on alternative solutions and measures to improve where you've identified gaps. So the examples here would be having a power generator for a building, or upgrading certain parts of your IT systems, or having separate teams working on a critical service so that if one team fails, somebody else can pick it up. And then once you've got those various mitigation strategies in place, you can then write your plans, which is what you'll use in order to run the business and keep your business going through a disruption. This will include BC plans, but recovery runbooks and communications plans for dealing with the disruption. People might think of a plan, but it's a series, if you like, of guidance, checklists, of documents. The planning is the whole process, and then at this stage, really, is what you're doing is you're documenting what you've decided you need to do. So that's really building or enacting your BC plan, and then finally, you need to know that those plans work. So the whole point of testing and exercising is to check that your plans, your run books, and anything else that you've got work. You don't know that they work until you've had a go at trying them out, and then you can learn any lessons that need to fall out of that in a test environment rather than the real life event. You don't want to be learning on the job in the event of a real life disruption. And then, of course, you've got to keep things going, keep your plans up to date. I mentioned the word life cycle earlier. This is an important part of business continuity planning, is that keeping everything up to date based on changes in your context, your environment, and any lessons learned. So that's really your testing and your maintenance phase. So what I want to do now is break those down into a bit more detail and give you some top tips as to how you can pull together the BC planning side of things. Let's look at the policy and how it all fits together at the very top. Policy, of course, starts right at the top of the organization, dictates everything you're trying to do. It's where the strategy is set for the business. That leads your management processes and then the operational activities that sit underneath that to deliver what it is you deliver. And we talk frequently about integrated business resilience because you can't have silos, especially in business continuity and resilience more generally. The strategy is set at the top by the senior leadership team. Your management and operations deliver the products, goods and services to customers in line with all of your cost, time and quality requirements, all of this being fundamentally underpinned by technology. Technology team makes sure that the data that you need to run those processes and operations and the confidentiality, integrity and availability of that data and systems is there and available as when you need it. So within your policies, you need to be able to set out how the leadership teams, not just the C-suite, but everyone else, would expect disruptions to be escalated and to what level. Not everything is indeed managed by the C-suite or the CEO and the crisis team, but there are some scenarios where they would expect that the issue would be escalated very quickly to the very top. And the best example of that would, of course, be a cyber attack, especially if it included a ransom scenario. So you need to lay out what your escalation levels are. But you also need to establish what your command and control layers are, and that would include the various response structures and teams. Now, larger organizations would use a gold, silver, bronze structure, and some of you will be familiar with that, and that will be familiar to indeed to anyone who's got experience of the emergency services and local resilience. So some organizations, the biggest companies may well have several silver teams covering sites or business units and multiple bronze teams covering facilities and IT and likewise. But of course, that is entirely dependent on your context, and for a much smaller organization, just keep it simple. You might only have one or a maximum of two teams. You might pull together the executive team to run a crisis, but actually a separate incident response team that covers everything else. So keep that command and control structure relevant to your organization. And basically what we've got is IT disaster recovery covers the overlap between IT infrastructure and technology and operations, and then the BCP focuses on everything on top of that. So in laying out your policy and what you're trying to achieve, that's what you need to pull together to set the framework for your planning activities. So now moving on to looking at the team and who needs to be involved. So these are the sorts of people that should be involved by sort of levels in the business and the stages in your continuity planning. So you do need to have a high-level risk sponsor, business continuity and risk sponsor, who could well be the CEO or the managing director or even the COO. Again, depends on your organization, but you do need that top-level sponsorship. They're responsible for setting the scope and the policy, and you bring in the crisis team as well to help work out how they would operate together and what their responsibilities are for that level of response. But when you're then working out what the priorities are and the importance of business activities, you need to consult more widely across the organization, and in particular with those who really understand how those bits of the business work. You need to be able to connect that into the wider business strategy, and having a really sensible conversation, and I stress the word sensible, about how quickly activities need to be resumed is really important. Many people, if you start out with BC, will tell you that what they do in the business is the most important thing that happens. But let's be realistic, you can't recover everything in the business inside 4 hours, nor do you actually need to. So have a sensible management-led conversation about your business priorities is really important, because that will then set the tone for the rest of your BC planning. And then you'll also need engagement from the managers at the operational level to make sure that everything all fits together, that your business continuity fits in with your disaster recovery and your communications. You've also got to consider how you will prepare people and raise awareness of your plans, because until, as we've said and is often said in business continuity planning, until you know how things fit together and have practiced them in an exercise, you won't really have the confidence that they will work in what you might call the heat of the battle. So there's a bunch of people who need to be involved in this and selecting the team. Some of those are involved in the planning and analysis, and some of those people are involved in the response phase, and you need to make sure they're all aligned. So we're now going to move on to the third stage, which is around the BIA and looking at your risks. So the BIA, as said once, is a really important part of BC planning. This is your sort of big workhorse approach to assessment and analysis. And it's where you go through the detailed analysis of what your business continuity requirements are. And it's fundamentally based around analysing the impacts over time of a disruption on the organisation, as you can see from the definition from the international standard. So this is what leads you to set out and design your various mitigation strategies. It involves assessing where you are right now and where you want to be in the future. The BIA does include the assessment of risks of the business impacts of disruption. You need to calculate the cost of downtime. You need to think about your maximum tolerable period of disruption that you're willing to accept. In other words, how long can you be disrupted for and still not have your business fundamentally threatened? And it also critically involves mapping the upstream and downstream dependencies. And again, we've got some tools on our website which you can use. Again, they're fairly simple. They are free, but they're on the website and they'll be linked in the resources at the end. So effectively, your BIA then is going to include what your business functions are by department, the dependencies and the services that support those critical functions, understanding what their criticality is to you, to the operational delivery for your business, what it means to you as a business if you cannot perform and deliver those functions. When we talk about dependencies, we must think about the upstream as well as the downstream dependencies. You know, it's who depends on that department as well as what is needed to deliver those services. Out of all of which, you can define your recovery objectives and the justifications to the business as to why those recovery objectives are what they are. And all of that gives the information that you need to start to write your plans. It's worth thinking a little bit just now then about what this means from a budgetary point of view. It's not in any way an exact science, but there's a few considerations to consider here. So, you know, again, it comes back to the context that you operate in your business. If you've got two companies and one's an investment bank and the other one's a house builder, they will have very different requirements. And the one that has got the higher cost of downtime is likely to be spending more time and money on their resilience capabilities as a consequence. Basically, the more you've got to lose, the more you need to spend to protect it. And other factors would include things like, you know, weather, not just your IT resilience. So, you know, you can see a big difference between somebody who operates in, for example, Florida, where extreme weather is a frequent event, against, you know, again, similar type of business working in the Midlands here in Britain. If you're close to a major oil refinery, and some of you will remember back to Buncefield in, I think it was 1996, you know, that sort of example will also drive your strategies. All of these things come with different costs, and effectively, you know, the longer you leave things, the higher the potential cost of business disruption. So the red line here is this cost of disruption. In the very short term, you may not lose any actual money, but as time goes on, you know, the cost of business disruption gets more and more. And what you want to avoid is breaching that vertical line on the right on this slide, which is the maximum tolerable period of downtime. And really, if you go beyond that, you've effectively gone out of business. And then the black line on the left is your cost of continuity solution. And, you know, having a low cost might also equate to a slow time to recover, but you've got to find the balance between that and having a very fast recovery time. For example, if you need zero downtime, like my example with Facebook at the start, that cost really is very significant. So you might have different solutions for different parts of the organization depending on what the priorities are. So again, on the website, we've got a cost of downtime calculator. It's in the tools. Have a dig that out when you finish this webinar. So how do you work out what is a reasonable cost for you, and what are the ways that you need to think about this? Well, you really do need to work out what your maximum tolerable period of downtime is, and you can then work out how you get there. And there's some various components in recovery planning. So firstly, you've got your RTO, which is your recovery time objective. How long does it take you to restore a business service or a system? How long does it take to get that back up and running? The next question is around your RPO, your recovery point objective, which is basically how much data loss are you willing to tolerate? And that can range from zero data loss through to, you know, days or weeks. Part of that is driven by, or will drive your backup strategy. But then you've also got to consider, what is your current work recovery time? How long does it take you to actually restore systems and get data available again to allow business activities to take place so that your staff can carry on working? If you call that a work recovery time, you need to then compare what your actual work recovery time is against your maximum tolerable downtime. And if you can't restore in a time that's acceptable, that tells you that you need to start investing in your resilience capabilities for things like redundancy, duplication of effort, you know, sites, better backups, faster disaster recovery. there are a range of options that will come out of the BIA. So the real questions are, how fast do you need to be up and running again, and how much data are you happy to lose, and are you in a position where that's within your maximum tolerable period of downtime? So we talked earlier then in the next stage about what your important functions and services are. You need to know what it is you deliver to your customers, and how you deliver them and how you pull them together is really important. And this is really about dependency mapping. And this is a screenshot from, again, our simple dependency mapping tool that's on the website. It provides you the information, and you need to, whether you make it look like this or another way, you need to be able to connect the service, the people, the teams, the suppliers, the systems and the components to deliver each of those services. So we started off developing this to map IT services together to the assets that support them, but you can use it to map any assets through to those services. It's up to you how you define them. There are plenty of advanced software products out there which are great for the bigger, larger enterprise level customers, and many of those are designed around operational resilience requirements. They're very capable, but they're also perhaps too complex for your average small or medium-sized business. So we designed this to be fairly simple, but the point behind it is you need to map out how your business delivers its important business services and work out where there may be points of weakness and vulnerabilities. Like, for example, on here, you can see in some of the components that are on the left connect to multiple services. So therefore, you might have several services that are affected if one particular component is affected by disruption. And understanding that is really important for business continuity planning. And the colors here related to speed of response. You'll have, the faster you are, the greener the dial is, the slower it is, the redder it is in this particular example. So once you've understood those, you're then getting into the next stage, which is around defining your mitigation strategies and writing your plans. So this is now where we're getting into the doing phase, if you like. So having worked out what's important for your business, you know what assets and resources you need to deliver your services, and you've agreed and had approved your recovery objectives, you then develop all the mitigation strategies to deliver those. And often people think about this in terms of IT. It's absolutely not just in IT. You need to know if you need alternate suppliers and how you would arrange to get the services from those suppliers if they go into some form of disruption themselves. And we've seen this significantly in the last 12 months or so, where there have been a number of supply chain cyber attacks, and that's caused quite significant disruption. So suppliers is definitely a key component. We talk about people and premises, teams and sites. The good old-fashioned recovery site may be slightly out of fashion with everyone working from home, but there are businesses and teams for whom working from home doesn't prove to be an effective continuity strategy. So you do need to think about it and not just assume that work from home is the answer for absolutely everyone, although it will be the default for many. But these strategies, basically, whether they're IT or otherwise, all need to come together in a cost-effective way that allows you to improve your overall resilience and make sure that you can keep your business operating in the event of that disruption. And they all come out of the analysis that you've done so far. And then you're into the phase, so we're quite a way into this, if you like, where you're actually writing your business continuity plans, which is how you then put all these capabilities into place, into practice, and how you'd use them in anger in the event of a disruption. So you're definitely going to be planning for the risks and the threats that you've identified. These plans need to be written so that they're nice, concise, specific. They can be followed in the heat of the moment, and using a checklist which has enough detail to allow the team to get going, but also having sufficient to cover some key incidents or scenarios that you are particularly concerned about. And it's worth reminding everyone that these documents should be written for somebody who doesn't have necessarily the specific knowledge of BC. For example, if you talk about calling supplier, include the number of that supplier. If you need to have access to a password in order to activate a particular online service that you'd use, where would you find it? Those need to be included somewhere, bearing in mind the constraints of security, but they need to be available for the team that are responding. And that may well be that this plan is in the boot of somebody's car, because there's a classic example where, fairly recent, I think 3 or 4 years ago, a company was hit by a cyber attack, and the only available plans that they had without any access to their network was the resilience manager who held an up-to-date copy in the boot of his car, and that's how they got going. So these plans need to be kept useful. So short, actionable plans with simple to follow guidance for escalation and decision making, written in a way that makes it easy to use and supported by simple checklists. And here's an example of the kind of structure of a BC plan, which would work for one type of organization. And you're pulling together information on, who is the team, what do they do, how do they get invoked and activated, how do they meet, where do they meet, including online, what guidance might they need for taking effective decisions, what guidance do they need on communications, information management, logistics, and it's always worth having some scenario guidance. For example, having a cyber playbook for the crisis management team is a really useful thing so that they know how they might have to respond in that particular scenario. You can't cover everything, so don't try to, but having the guidance on the things that are in your risk register as a priority is really useful. Talk there about communications briefly. Communicating in a disaster is a massive challenge. It's a bit of a truism that the worst crises have been characterized by poor communications. And you don't want to be working out your communication strategies at the time of the crisis. So you do need to have something specific to crisis communications, and you need to practice this. Practice your PR, your media and comms, and practice your media. Those who will stand up in front of the cameras, if you like. And it's about getting the messaging right, getting these coherent and consistent between the various levels. You'll be messaging internally to the staff and any visitors you might have, contractors, suppliers, but also you'll be starting to communicate externally to media, to customers, potentially to regulators and to shareholders. And this is something that absolutely has to be focused on, because we've had too many examples of complaints in the public where people say they just haven't had sufficient communications. Remember Churchill's old adage, a lie will get halfway around the world before the truth manages to pull its boots on. So we're then coming towards the latter stages. Now, having got your plan in place, you then need to run through exercising and testing. And the title here is Test IT, not Test It. And actually, there's a bit of a distinction here deliberately between testing and exercising. A test is something that can be failed. And for example, in IT terms, you would test the restore of a server. And you're simply saying, could we recover that server in line with our plan? Yes or no? Yes, pass. No, fail. So that is a test, and that's a specific scenario. But from a business continuity point of view, you're not testing your plan. You're exercising the plan, and you're exercising the people that are responsible for it. And it gives you a chance to raise awareness of the plan, of how it works, and it also raises the confidence in those who are expected to use a plan in anger. And you don't, as we said a couple of times, you won't know if a plan will work until you've had a go at practicing it. And what you need to try and get away from is this being a 90 minutes once a year session. You need to really, this day and age, be making this more demanding and more frequent, and running separate exercises to make sure that your deputies are available, are familiar rather with the plan and how it works. Because I can guarantee one thing, that at the time of disaster, your planned A team won't all be available. So make it testing and exercising appropriate for your organization. It is important. It should be more frequently than once a year. Then perhaps plan a sort of a significant exercise once a year, but then have smaller tabletop, desktop type exercises. And anytime you come up with a new risk, then explore it, tease it apart, and see what it means for your planning. But then in testing your plan as well, it's worth considering how you do that when we talk about testing and exercising. If you assess that your response teams are fairly inexperienced, perhaps lack a little bit of maturity in this, then think about starting very simply with some desktop exercises. Take a crawl, walk, run approach for exercising. Start with something simple that everyone can get their head around, and then build up over time to more complex disruptions. And in the ideal world, you will include key suppliers. And again, I mentioned earlier the recent history of supply chain cyber attacks. Work with them to make sure that you've got that support you will need in the event of that disruption. If you don't know where to start, then have a look at your risk register, see what's worrying the leadership team the most, design a simple scenario around one of your top risks. But there's also similar sorts of guidance on a range of websites. There's a National Risk Register, recently updated for 2023 is the latest version. That's pretty good. Another good place to start from a cyber point of view is the National Cybersecurity Centre's Exercise in the Box toolkit, which is on their website too. And they've got a series of short, complex scenarios. We've also got in our resource section a tabletop exercising simulator with 3 different example disasters to work through using the runbook questionnaires that we've developed. So there's another place to start. Again, pretty straightforward, is it, for those who are at the start of their journey. And then the very final stage in all of this is around ongoing changes and maintenance. How do you stay on top of everything and make sure it's not just a hit and run, done once and then forgotten about? So the BCI does talk about business continuity management systems, and they've got this life cycle. This is straight out of the latest standard, and it's visualized as a circle for a reason, because BC and business continuity management doesn't end. Try and build this into your everyday processes. You've got to have an annual fire drill for your buildings. Factor this into your planning and your business activities. Factor it into your normal change control processes. You'll only really be resilient once continuity is embedded into what you do. This is becoming a lot more accepted and understood across businesses nowadays, but of course there are a range of operational resource pressures on companies, and have been since really since the 2020 and COVID. So it's easy to let it slide, but being resilient is fundamentally a business enabler. So don't just look to embed it, as this now says, embrace business continuity. So that's the link to that's the material I wanted to cover today. I hope you found that useful. Obviously, we'll be sharing all the slides with you afterwards. These are the resources I've talked about. So there's a link to the good practice guidance. There'll be in the slides when you get them, the National Risk Register, our own toolkit, and our own BC podcast, which has proven to be very popular over the years. And there's a lot of really good interviews and discussions on there. That's what will come out to you. And I mentioned a few others as well throughout today. What I'm now going to be able to move on to is questions. I can see there's a couple in the chat that have come up. And first of all, one of the questions that came up in advance was the question around the BIA, where somebody made the point that the BIA is critical for business continuity planning. I hope that I brought that out today effectively in what I've said, and I completely agree with the person who made that point, which is that the BIA is absolutely essential to getting your business continuity planning right. So there's a question here. So would you recommend a DR plan for every system if it is not business critical? Ideally, you need to be able to recover all systems, but business critical systems are where you start, definitely. And if you understand what the impacts of a system going down and failing is, you will just have you still need the ability to recover that system, because if you don't, it would imply that you don't need it. So this is really about prioritizing what's important. So when we talk about DR plans, and I suppose it's also worth separating or deconflicting the concept of a DR plan, which is, if you like, your overall approach to disaster recovery, and then DR runbooks, which is something that's much more technical and is designed to be able to recover systems and give the guidance, step-by-step guidance to IT teams to be able to restore those critical systems. So I guess to sort of summarize that, you've got an overall ITDR plan that sits alongside your BC plan, and then underneath that you do have DR runbooks for your critical systems, and ideally you'll build up over time and create recovery plans for all of your systems, so to make sure that you know how you get them back up and running. So hopefully that answers that question. So the second question is, for a small organization, could the crisis management plan be included in the business continuity plan? Absolutely, yes. You can have one plan that covers everything, but and the thing I mentioned in my in that section of the presentation was where you differentiate the response levels. It may well be that if you've got a really small company of say 10 or 15 people, it's the same people responding to everything. And if that's the case, absolutely, you don't need a whole load of different plans. Come back to the fundamental principle of keep it simple and keep it appropriate for the context of your organization. So if you've got a small team, and it doesn't really matter how, you might have a small team that runs a really valuable business. Actually, if what you do is just really good and run by a small team, it's the same people who will be responding to everything. What you're laying out, though, in that is scenario-based guidance for how they'd respond when there was a crisis against a business disruption. So apologies, I've put an abbreviation in, CMT, in the selecting the team slide. That stands for the Crisis Management Team. So apologies if I didn't make that clear in that part of the presentation. So the Crisis Management Team is the most senior and experienced management team that you would expect to come together at the time of a crisis in order to lead the company or the organization out of the crisis. And in business continuity terms, we normally differentiate a crisis from an incident, and the severity of the disruption is what makes that differential. So a crisis is where the business is fundamentally and potentially threatened. Its existence is potentially threatened. If the crisis is mishandled, you could go out of business. And that there are examples throughout business history of that. And then beneath that, you'd have your business continuity or your incident management team who'd be looking at the operational level disruptions to business activities. So I hope that answers that and clearly separates that distinction between a crisis management team, senior people, incident management team, business management staff. So how critical, the next question is, how critical is the responsible sponsor, and are they required for ongoing maintenance? And this is from a small company. It's a small, describe themselves as a small pharma company. It's really important to have executive ownership of resilience. So I guess what's slightly behind your question there is what that responsible sponsor is doing. So let's separate out having that sort of senior ownership and accountability for business resilience in an organization, and the team who be looking after the ongoing maintenance of a business continuity plan or a business continuity life cycle. Ownership and leadership has to sit at the executive management board, within the executive management team, because that's the way that resources get applied. That's where roles, responsibilities, and resources get applied, and the agreed understanding and priorities can be established. However, yes, you wouldn't have somebody from the C-suite acting as a business continuity manager. That's where you'd have, in the right size of company, a dedicated BC manager who'd be responsible for keeping the life cycle going and managing the system. If you're in a smaller company, then you might split those responsibilities between various managers and staff across different teams in the organization. So again, it comes back to keep it simple, keep it appropriate for your context, but have it at the appropriate level, so that it's got the priority and the visibility. What I've seen, less so more recently, but certainly historically, where there isn't that senior level visibility and ownership, it really isn't prioritized, and you know what your risks are. And if you're not prioritizing these sorts of resilience activities, they won't get done. So that's why it's important to have that level of sponsorship. But do separate out the sort of sponsorship at the C-suite against responsibility for implementing elements of a business continuity life cycle. So final one, are there any other questions? Last chance for anyone who'd like to ping one out. Do feel free to type one in. No, that's great. Well, again, I hope you found that useful. You certainly feel free to reach out to us following receipt of all the various material from today's webinar and the recording and the slides. Be very happy to pick up on any of this with anyone who's interested for further questions or discussion. I hope you find some of the resources on our website useful. We've also got various other webinars on our YouTube channel, on the Databarracks YouTube channel. There's lots to go and look at out there. Thank you very much for attending today, and I look forward to joining you all on our next webinar.